I was 6 years old the day my mother left. 6 years old, standing on the cracked linoleum of our tiny kitchen, staring up at her as she packed a single suitcase, her face unreadable. The air smelled like burnt toast. She had forgotten about breakfast again. "You'll understand one day," she said, not looking at me. I didn't understand. She zipped up the suitcase with a quick, sharp movement, like ripping off a bandage. My grandmother stood in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her like she was trying to keep them from reaching out. I remember the look in her eyes: resentment, sadness, but no surprise. Like she had always known this day would come. "I can't waste my life here," my mother continued, snapping the locks shut. Her voice was tense, impatient. "I have a future waiting for me." I still remember what she was wearing: tight jeans, a low-cut blouse, and heels that clicked sharply on the floor as she moved. She looked like the women I had seen in magazines, the kind of women people stopped to look at. My mother was beautiful. I had always thought so. I grabbed the sleeve of her blouse. "Mama, where are you going?" My voice was small, almost a whisper. She sighed, not unkindly, and crouched down so we were at eye level. For a moment, I thought she would change her mind. That she would see me, really see me, and stay. But she didn't. "I got a job in New York," she said. "A real job, not like this. Not like this life." Her eyes flickered around our tiny apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the chip table, the sink full of unwashed dishes. "I can't make it if I stay here." "You don't want me to waste my talent, do you?" I didn't know what talent she meant. She used to sing sometimes, standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, swaying to a rhythm only she could hear. But I didn't care about any of that. I cared about the fact that she was leaving. "I'll come back for you," she said, brushing a hand through my hair. "When things are better. When I've made it." She didn't cry. She didn't even look sad. She kissed my forehead, and then she was gone. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass. I saw her get into a cab, saw her put on big sunglasses like the movie stars wore. She didn't look back. Not once. That was the last time I saw my mother for almost 20 years. The aftermath. The days after she left blurred together in a haze of confusion and pain. My grandmother tried to shield me from it, but I wasn't stupid. I heard her on the phone, yelling, "You don't just leave a child behind, Marissa. You don't know, I don't care about your goddamn career. He's your son." At night, I lay awake, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator, the distant sound of car horns outside. I waited for her to come back. Every time footsteps passed our door, my heart leapt. But it was never her. The money she left behind, a few crumpled bills in an envelope, ran out fast. My grandmother did her best, but we were already struggling before my mother left. Afterward, things only got worse. The landlord stopped being polite. The fridge was emptier each week. My grandmother worked long shifts at a laundromat, coming home exhausted, her hands raw from the detergent. And me? I stopped waiting by the window. Because deep down, I knew the truth. She wasn't coming back. A boy without a mother. Kids at school didn't understand. "Your mom's on TV," they'd ask, excited. "That's so cool." I didn't know if she was on TV. I didn't know anything about her life in New York. Sometimes, I imagined she was living in a huge apartment with gold chandeliers, sipping fancy drinks with people who laughed at my poverty, at my existence. Other times, I imagined she had failed, that she was sleeping on a park bench, hungry and alone. Neither thought made me feel any better. One day, I found a photo of her stuffed in a drawer. She was smiling in the picture, standing on a stage, a microphone in her hand. She looked like she belonged there. Like she had never belonged with me. That was the day something in me hardened. I was no longer the boy waiting at the window. I was the boy who had been left behind. And I would never let anyone forget it. Surviving without her. After my mother left, life became a game of endurance. My grandmother did everything she could, but love doesn't pay rent. I learned quickly that food wasn't guaranteed, and that the world had little patience for a poor boy with a missing mother. Our apartment was falling apart. The ceiling leaked when it rained, the heater rattled in the winter, and roaches scurried across the kitchen floor no matter how many times we cleaned. I shared a mattress with my grandmother, and some nights I'd wake up to the sound of her muffled cries. I pretended to be asleep. School wasn't much better. My clothes were too small, my shoes worn down to thin soles. Kids noticed. They always do. "Did your mom leave because you smell?" a boy asked once, laughing. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to tell him that my mother was famous, that she was in magazines, that she was going to come back with a suitcase full of money and take me away from all of this. But I wasn't 6 anymore. I knew better. So instead, I stayed quiet. I swallowed my anger, my shame. I learned how to blend in, how to be invisible. But at home, it was different. At home, I couldn't escape the silence she left behind. One night, I asked my grandmother why my mother never called. "She's busy," was all she said. I didn't ask again. Discovering art. I don't remember the first time I picked up a pencil and started drawing. But I remember the feeling it gave me, like I could create something that belonged only to me. At first, it was just doodles in the margins of my school notebooks. Then, it became something more. I'd sit for hours with scraps of paper, drawing anything I could think of. Faces, hands, city skylines, the things I wished I had. My grandmother noticed. "You have a gift," she said one evening, watching me sketch by candlelight during one of our power outages. I shrugged. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like the only thing that made sense. She saved up and bought me a small set of paints for my 10th birthday. I remember running my fingers over the smooth wooden box, afraid to open it, afraid to waste something so precious. But when I did, when I dipped my brush into that first swirl of color, I felt something shift inside me. It was the first time I truly felt in control. A hard lesson in reality. Art became my escape, my obsession. But obsessions don't put food on the table. By the time I was 13, my grandmother was too old to work long hours, and money became even tighter. I started doing odd jobs, sweeping floors at the corner store, running errands for neighbors, anything that would get us through another week. Sometimes, I stole. Nothing big, just food when we needed it. I knew it was wrong, but I also knew what it felt like to go to bed hungry. And when you're hungry enough, morals start to blur. One winter, we couldn't afford heat. My grandmother got sick. She tried to hide it, but I saw how pale she got, how much weight she lost. One night, I sat by her bed, sketching her frail hands as she slept. I promised myself that one day, I would take care of her. That I would make something of myself, no matter what it took. But deep down, I knew I was running out of time. The breaking point. I was 15 when my grandmother passed away. She died in her sleep, her hands folded neatly over her stomach. I remember shaking her, whispering, "Grandma, wake up," over and over, as if I could bring her back by sheer will. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. I didn't cry at her funeral. I didn't have time to grieve. The apartment wasn't mine. I had no money, no relatives who wanted to take me in. So I left. I packed a small bag with my sketchbook, my paints, and a few clothes, and I walked out into the city with nowhere to go. The streets became my new home. And my art? It became my only hope. Life on the streets. At 15, I learned how cold concrete feels at night. I slept in doorways, abandoned buildings, under bridges when it rained. Some nights, I got lucky, church shelters, charity soup kitchens, but luck was just that, temporary. The world didn't care about a skinny teenager with a sketchbook and nowhere to go. Hunger became a constant, gnawing thing. I got good at finding food where I could, dumpsters behind bakeries, half-eaten sandwiches left on trays at outdoor cafes. But through all of it, I never stopped drawing. My art was the only thing that kept me sane. I'd sit on street corners, sketching the people who passed me by, the way their coats billowed in the wind, the way their eyes darted past me like I was invisible. And then, one day, I realized something. If I could make them stop, even for a second, maybe they'd pay me. The first dollar. I started drawing in public places, parks, subway stations, anywhere with foot traffic. I'd spread my sketches out on the sidewalk and hope for the best. At first, people just walked by. Then, one afternoon, a woman in a red coat stopped. "These are good," she said, flipping through my pages. She pulled a $10 bill from her purse and handed it to me. "Draw me." My hands shook as I sketched her. When I was done, she smiled. "You have a real talent." I ate a full meal that night for the first time in weeks. After that, I drew anyone willing to pay: tourists, street performers, even the occasional cop. I started making just enough to survive. And then, something even bigger happened. A stranger changes everything. One evening, I was sketching in front of a gallery downtown, trying to capture the way the neon lights reflected off the wet pavement. A man in a tailored suit stopped to watch. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes. "You draw these?" he asked. I nodded. He picked up one of my sketches, studying it. Then, he handed me a business card. "Come to this address tomorrow. I'd like to see more of your work." I almost didn't go. I had been burned before: people making promises they didn't keep, acting like they cared when they didn't. But something about him felt different. So the next day, I showed up at a sleek office with my sketchbook tucked under my arm. The man, whose name was Victor Langston, was an art dealer. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, he saw something in me. "You have raw talent," he said. "But talent isn't enough. If you want to make it, you need guidance. You need opportunity." Then he made me an offer, a chance to study, to refine my skills. A small apartment, a stipend. I was suspicious. I had spent years expecting nothing from anyone. But I was also desperate. So I said yes. From the streets to the studio. For the first time in years, I had a bed. A real one, with clean sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like mildew. I had meals that didn't come from a trash can. And I had paint. Endless, glorious paint. I threw myself into my work, learning everything I could. I studied the masters, practiced different techniques, experimented with colors and textures. Victor introduced me to people: gallery owners, collectors, critics. He pushed me to go bigger, bolder. "The world needs to feel your pain in your art," he told me. "Make them see you." So I did. I poured everything: my hunger, my loneliness, my abandonment, into my canvases. And slowly, people started to notice. My first gallery show was small, a cramped space with white walls and cheap wine. But my paintings sold. Not for much, but enough. Enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could be something more than a street kid with a sketchbook. The first taste of success. The next few years were a blur of paint and progress. My name started appearing in magazines. Collectors started bidding on my work. By 25, I was no longer surviving. I was thriving. And then, one night, at a crowded exhibition in a New York gallery, I saw her. My mother. Standing there, champagne flute in hand, staring at one of my paintings. A painting of a little boy waiting at a window. Face to face with the ghost of my past. For a moment, I thought I was imagining her. She looked older, but not in the way I had hoped. She was still beautiful, still had that presence that demanded attention, but the years had softened her in ways that unsettled me. The arrogance in her posture had faded, replaced with something more hesitant. I stood there, gripping my champagne glass so hard I thought it might shatter. My mind was screaming at me to turn away, to ignore her the same way she had ignored me for nearly 20 years. But I couldn't. She turned and saw me. And just like that, the years collapsed between us. Her lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "Oh my God," she whispered. I said nothing. She took a step closer, then stopped, as if realizing she didn't know how to approach me. As if she had no right to. "You," she swallowed hard. You've done well for yourself. I let the silence stretch between us. Let her feel it. Let her feel the weight of everything she had abandoned. Then, finally, I spoke. You recognize this painting? I asked, nodding toward the canvas she had been staring at. Her eyes flickered back to it. It was one of my earliest works, raw and unpolished. A little boy staring out a window, his small hands pressed against the glass. A suitcase sat in the corner, partially packed, a single woman's coat draped over it. She exhaled sharply, as if I had struck her. It's our apartment, she said softly. I nodded. The last day you were there. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I never forgot you, you know. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Could have fooled me. She flinched. For the first time, I saw something real in her expression. Guilt. Regret. Fear. Good. Her story, her excuses. She started talking, her words tumbling out in a rush. She told me how hard it had been to make it in the industry. How she had struggled, how she had scraped by, taking whatever role she could. I always meant to come back, she said, voice trembling. But every time I got close, I convinced myself you were better off. That you'd hate me for leaving. She looked down, ashamed. And I guess I was right. I stared at her, feeling nothing but exhaustion. You had a choice, I said finally. You had a son, and you left him. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought, she stopped herself. I thought I was doing the right thing. I shook my head. No. You were doing the easy thing. There's a difference. She fell silent. I watched her, waiting for something, an apology that meant something, a shred of sincerity that wasn't just regret for herself. But all I saw was a woman who had spent her whole life chasing a dream, only to realize too late what she had lost along the way. The real reason she came back. Then, she said the words that confirmed everything. I need your help. Of course. Her voice was quiet, but I heard the desperation beneath it. My career, it's not what it used to be. The roles dried up, the money ran out. I lost everything. She hesitated. I saw your name in a magazine. I didn't even recognize you at first, but when I saw your work, I knew. I waited, letting her squirm under the weight of her own words. And then she finally said it. I have nothing left. I should have felt satisfaction. This was what she deserved, wasn't it? To come crawling back, to see the life I had built without her, to realize she was nothing to me now. But I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt tired. My choice. I took a slow sip of my drink and set the glass down. Then I met her eyes, my voice calm. You left me with nothing, I said. You didn't call. You didn't write. You didn't come back. She opened her mouth, but I cut her off. You weren't there when I needed you. And now, after all these years, you suddenly remember you have a son? Because you need help? I laughed bitterly. That's convenient. She looked like she wanted to shrink into herself. I leaned in slightly. So tell me, Marissa, I said, deliberately using her name instead of Mom. Why should I give you anything? Her lower lip trembled. Because I'm your mother. I stared at her, then slowly shook my head. No, I said. You were my mother. A long time ago. She gasped, like I had hit her. I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. A long silence. She stood there, gripping the stem of her empty champagne glass like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For a moment, she looked smaller than I remembered. Less like the towering, untouchable figure from my childhood and more like a woman who had made too many mistakes. But I wasn't a child anymore. And I wasn't interested in fixing her mistakes. She took a shaky breath. Please, she whispered. I have nowhere else to go. I stared at her, my jaw tight. I had spent years dreaming of this moment. I had imagined myself standing above her, watching as she begged, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. I had thought that when this day came, I would revel in it. That I would enjoy making her suffer. But now, standing face to face with the woman who had once kissed my forehead before walking out of my life forever, I just felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just an empty, hollow space where something should have been. The truth she didn't want to hear. You don't get to do this, I said quietly. You don't get to show up after 20 years and act like you have a place in my life. She flinched. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? I let out a short, humorless laugh. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is missing a school play. What you did wasn't a mistake, Marissa. It was a decision. Her mouth opened slightly at the sound of her name, like it hurt to hear me say it. You left me, I continued, my voice steady. You left me with nothing. And you never once came back. Not when I was starving, not when I was sleeping on the streets, not even when Grandma died. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't know. Because you never wanted to know, I cut in. You wanted to forget. And now that you have nothing, you remember me? She looked down, her shoulders shaking. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt like I had finally won. Instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Her last plea. She wiped at her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried again. I don't deserve anything from you. I know that. She looked up, her voice trembling. But I'm not asking as a mother. I'm asking as a person. Just, help me get back on my feet. I stared at her. She was desperate, yes. But there was still something in her voice, some small part of her that still believed she was entitled to something from me. That no matter what she had done, no matter how many years had passed, I would still be the little boy who had once clung to her sleeve, begging her not to go. But that boy was gone. And I was done waiting for a mother who had never wanted me. My answer. I let the silence stretch between us, watching her squirm. Then, finally, I spoke. You know, I said slowly, I used to dream about this moment. She blinked. You did? I nodded. I used to imagine you coming back. I'd picture all the different ways I could make you suffer. Ignore you, humiliate you, maybe even throw you a few dollars just to watch you grovel. Her breath hitched. But now that you're here, I shrugged. I don't feel anything. Her lip trembled. Please. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my wallet, and took out a single $100 bill. I held it out to her. She stared at it, confusion flickering across her face. This is the last thing you'll ever get from me, I said. Take it, and don't ever contact me again. For a moment, she just stood there, her pride warring with her desperation. Then, finally, she reached out and took the money with a shaking hand. I watched as she clutched it tightly, as if it was the last piece of dignity she had left. Then I turned and walked away. And I didn't look back. Letting go. I walked out of the gallery and into the cold night air, my heart pounding even though I didn't know why. She was gone. The moment I had spent years imagining had come and gone, and now there was nothing left. No satisfaction, no closure. Just an emptiness that settled in my chest like a weight I wasn't sure how to lift. I leaned against the brick wall outside, staring at the city lights. For years, I had thought revenge would feel sweet. That making her feel small, making her beg, would erase all the pain she had caused me. But it didn't. Nothing could. Because at the end of the day, she wasn't the same woman who had left me at 6 years old. And I wasn't the same boy who had waited for her. We were strangers. And we always would be. Finding my own way. In the weeks that followed, I kept expecting to hear from her again. A voicemail, a letter, something. But she never reached out. Maybe she understood that there was nothing left to say. Or maybe she was just as good at disappearing as she always had been. Either way, I didn't care. My career continued to rise. My paintings sold for more money than I had ever dreamed of. People called me a genius, a visionary. They asked about my inspirations, about my past, about the pain they saw in my work. I let them speculate. I let them think whatever they wanted. Because the truth was, I wasn't painting for them. I was painting for the boy I used to be, the boy who had sat by a window, waiting for someone who was never coming back. The boy who had slept in doorways and sketched on scraps of paper. The boy who had survived. A different kind of family. One evening, after a long day at my studio, I found myself walking past a small art center for underprivileged kids. Through the window, I saw them, children hunched over canvases, their faces full of quiet concentration, their hands covered in paint. Something in me shifted. The next day, I made a call. And a month later, I opened my own program. It started small, just a few kids, a few supplies. But over time, it grew. I funded scholarships, mentored young artists, gave them the opportunities one never had. I saw myself in every one of them. The hunger, the desperation, the need to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I felt something real. Not anger. Not revenge. But purpose. The final thought. I never saw my mother again. I heard rumors, someone told me she had moved to another city, that she was still chasing roles that would never come. But I didn't care. Because I had finally learned the truth. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who stays. And she had never stayed. So I let her go. And for the first time in my life, I was free.